In this brief video, I'd like to talk about deductive reasoning, both what it is, how it can be done effectively, and how to spot whether or not it is faulty. So a deductive argument essentially starts with something that is a generalization or a proposition that has to be agreed upon. And then we move from that proposition, something that, again, we can establish as true already, in order to argue for something else, an additional conclusion that we can say is also true. Essentially, this is the entire basis, really, of the American legal system. So while a court case will rely upon inductive reasoning to determine the guilt or innocence of somebody in a trial, a sentencing phase, or the actual way in which the law is applied to that guilt or innocence, is based upon precedents. It's based upon what has come before. And so the precedent in a court case is essentially a deductive argument. It's looking at something that we agree to be true because it's what was done before, and then we move from that to establish new specific arguments. Oftentimes, scientific arguments will use deductive reasoning if they can. Deductive reasoning, if it can be applied effectively, can be one of the strongest forms of logic. At its most basic form, then, a deductive argument can be represented in what we call a syllogism. And a syllogism is essentially a way of just writing a deductive argument. The classical syllogism would be as follows. We'd start with a generalization, again, something that we know is absolutely true, something like all men are mortal. We would then have a second proposition, something like Socrates is a man. Now again, based on both of these two statements then, I can make the conclusion that Socrates is then mortal. If all men are mortal, if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. One way that we can determine whether or not a deductive argument has sound logic is by applying an Euler diagram to that deductive argument. So let's take our all men are mortal example. We start with the generalization. In an Euler diagram, it's similar a little bit to a Venn diagram in that we're using circles. But instead of using overlapping circles, we're using concentric circles, circles that are within each other. So we start with the most general part of that statement, things that are mortal. Within that more general part of the statement, we have all men. Now, first off, as I look at that picture, visually, it does represent a truth. All human beings are mortal. The second proposition, then, I'm going to make the argument that Socrates, or I'm going to make the observation, rather, that Socrates is a man. In that case, he fits both within the smaller circle as well as the larger circle, which means that the conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal, is a sound conclusion. Because he fits within the smaller circle, and that smaller circle fits within the larger circle, the argument is logical. An Euler diagram, then, can be used to determine when a deductive argument might look like it is fitting all the requirements, but might be faulty in its logic. So, for example, if I take a generalization like ballerinas dance. Now, again, this generalization is true. Ballerinas do dance. The most general part of that is those who dance. Ballerinas will fall within that. If I have the proposition, I dance in the living room with the blinds closed, I'm going to be inside of the larger circle. I may be within the smaller circle, but if my conclusion is, therefore, I'm a ballerina, that conclusion is not logically sound. Just a few more of these then. Architects use computers. The more general part is those who use computers. Within that, we put architects. I use a computer. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm an architect. Doctors eat lunch. So those who eat lunch is the more general part of that statement. Doctors fit within that. I eat lunch. So I'm a doctor? Maybe not. And finally, they say God built the world in 7 days. So you got people who build things in 7 days. Within that, you'd put deities. I built my tool shed in 7 days. So I'm a god. Probably not. I fit within the larger generalization, but I don't necessarily fit within the smaller one. Another place where problems arise, aside from faulty initial points, is when the conclusions aren't going to fit the data, or when perhaps the generalization is an either-or kind of statement. So, for example, if you start with a generalization that's problematic, then the conclusions you're going to make based on that generalization are also going to be problematic. So, if I take an either-or example, let's say I have a statement like either you are married or you have nobody. And then if I tried to make arguments out of that, hey, you're not married, so therefore you have nobody. The problem with that is that there's obviously a whole continuum between married and having nobody. Either you're a saint or a sinner. Again, there may be a wide continuum there. Either your bike tire is flat or it's full. Again, it might be half full. It might be part of the way full. The tricky thing then is that deductive arguments in some ways rely upon simplicity. The simpler the argument is that you're making, the easier it is to have sound deductive logic. The more complicated the argument is, the harder it is to have a clear, sound deductive argument. In legal arguments then, so I said at the beginning of this that precedence is the way in which we determine punishment and we determine the application of the law in the American legal system. So the trickier it is, the harder it is to use that kind of a deductive argument. So in a legal proceeding, if somebody is found guilty of something, whatever it is that they are found guilty of, the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney will then look at precedent. They will look at previous court cases, and they will try and determine what should be the punishment based on how that particular kind of crime has been punished in the past. So, for example, let's say somebody was convicted of stealing a car. A prosecuting attorney will look over the course of the past several years, over the course of different court cases, and depending on how egregious the prosecuting attorney thinks that this crime was, the prosecuting attorney will try and find examples of sentences that the attorney feels are appropriate. So if the prosecuting attorney feels that this particular act of theft was a particularly bad one, he or she will find places in the law where a person has been given a lot of time, given a long prison sentence for stealing a car. The defense attorney, then, his or her job is to try and find precedent that is as close to the current case that gives the client or the person who's been being judged the lowest penalty possible. So a defense attorney will look back through the court cases and will try and find some time where a person who stole a car got very little jail time or got no jail time at all, perhaps. Again, the tricky thing about this is that we can take something like stealing a car and we can say to ourselves, oh, well, okay, there should always be one punishment for stealing a car. It should always be X number of years. This is what mandatory sentencing guidelines are trying to do. But I think pretty quickly, we as viewers of a court case can come up with a rationale why one theft of a car might be a particularly worse theft of a car than perhaps another. So just as a hypothetical, if somebody was being convicted of stealing a car, but that person stole that car to take a friend who was lost his foot in a bizarre gardening accident to the hospital. So this guy's friend has been chopped off in the garden, and without getting that car, stealing that car and taking the friend to the hospital, the friend would bleed out and die. I think we would look at that and we might say to ourselves, well, yeah, the person stole the car, but that's not as bad, perhaps, as maybe another person, perhaps a career criminal who steals cars for a living, and this is one of the only times that this person's been caught, steals cars and uses the money to fund a white supremacist group. In that case, we might say to ourselves, hey, the guy who's stealing cars for a living and funding the white supremacist group, that person should get a much better, bigger sentence, a much worse sentence than the person who stole the car in order to get his friend who had lost his foot in a bizarre gardening accident to the hospital. Another place where this becomes problematic is with sentencing in capital cases, in death penalty cases. So, for example, in Washington State, we're a death penalty state, and yet the most notorious serial killer, Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who is admitted to killing 48 women, was given 48 consecutive life sentences, was not given the death penalty in this state because he cooperated with police. Now, it may well have been within the within the police's, it certainly was within the police's purview. It may well have been a thing that we wanted to have happen because we wanted to close those cases. But since Gary Ridgway has been caught, it becomes more difficult then to say that the precedent is if you commit murder in the state of Washington, you should get the death penalty. Because the most notorious murderer, the most heinous murderer, really, in the state, the person who's killed the most people in the state on an individual basis, is serving essentially a life sentence. In scientific studies, the greater, the more discrete the data can be, the easier it is then for the scientists to make a deductive argument to say, because this is true and this is true, I know this next thing will be true. But again, the more complicated that argument gets, the harder it becomes. So, for example, in drug trials, the scientists may try and figure out if a drug does X to a person, and X leads to health in some way, then they say that, well, this drug is safe. The difficulty is all the side effects with a drug. So if you look at just the discrete data on one effect, your argument may be logical that it leads to health, but the side effects may be so great that it's not worth taking.